I see it. Tony.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tony Cube. I'm joined with Todd Scribner and Matthew Wilch on this webinar. We'll get started in just a moment here, okay? Todd and Matt, so you know, we've started recording the webinar already, and you can see the beginning slide there on your monitors. So we'll get started here in another minute and a half.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, well, I have the top of the hour, and I expect that we'll be joined in just a few minutes by others, Todd. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, if that's okay with Matt and Todd.
Sure.
That's fine.
Okay, great. Let's see here. So thank you, everybody, for joining us on this webinar today. We understand that it's a challenging situation right now around the country, and you know, you folks are probably not at your office, and if you are, please take good care of yourselves, and even if you are in your office, and to everyone, whether you're at home or trying to avoid contact with other folks. Please know that you are in our thoughts, and we appreciate you taking time today to participate in this webinar and learn about World Refugee Day 2020. Todd and Matt, I'm managing the technology on my end here, so as you have any need for advancing to the next slide, just let me know, and I'll go ahead and advance that. I'll let Sister Peggy know as soon as she joins us too about how we can move on into the next slide. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and move us over. Presenting today will be my colleagues Todd Scribner with Migration and Refugee Services here at the USCCB, Matt Wilch with Migration and Refugee Services as well, and Sister Peggy Boehm, who is with Caminando Juntos in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Todd Scribner. Todd, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Tony. I appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone for joining. And for those who may listen, you know, in the coming days or weeks, if you're not able to join us today, I really appreciate you taking the time. This is obviously a webinar that's focusing on World Refugee Day because that's right around the corner once again. But we're going to kind of delve into an array of issues related to sort of refugees, refugee resettlement, kind of just take stock of where we are. You know, and this is particularly important because 40 years ago, in 1980, the Refugee Act of 1980 became law, and that was really obviously the piece of legislation that has guided this private-public partnership for the past 40 years. And, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, along with Catholic charities across the country, and a wide range of other organizations who've had a, incredibly important role in refugee resettlement, has sort of taken their lead from this piece of legislation. So we wanted to take a moment to kind of reflect on that. And also, as part of it, kind of looking at the roots of the resettlement program. I want to just briefly talk about some of the aspects that sort of got us here today, particularly from the period in the post-World War II world to 1980 and then up to the present. I promise I won't go on some sort of a hour-long lecture, but just to briefly highlight some key points that are important for our understanding of the refugee resettlement program. It's particularly important given the pressures that we now face within the program. And that's really going to provide an opportunity to transition to Matt Wilch, who's going to look at the state of the situation, basically some of the contemporary challenges, and really some of the promising possibilities that we face as well with regards to refugee resettlement, in the coming months and hopefully the coming years. And then with Sister Peggy, hopefully she'll be able to join. She is going to talk about taking action on the local level, which is super, super important. The program as it is today, as it functions, throughout the entirety of the program, is really only made possible by people on the local level, the volunteers, the Catholic charity staff, the other organizations that really have an integral part in making it happen and making it happen well. And also on the advocacy side is a really important component of what we're doing, again, particularly today given the challenges that we face. So we can go to the next slide, Tony. So I wanted to, take a moment to sort of open with a prayer. I guess it's a moment for grace. It's courtesy of Catholic Relief Services. So we just take a moment. I'll read it out loud, and you all hopefully can just sort of read along as well as we move into this. God of our wandering ancestors, long have we known that your heart is with the refugee, that you were born into time in a family of refugees fleeing violence in their homeland, who then gathered up their hungry child and fled into an alien country. Their cry, your cry, resounds throughout the ages. Will you let me in? Give us hearts that break open when our brothers and sisters turn to us with that same cry. Then surely all these things will follow. Ears will no longer turn deaf to their voices. Eyes will see a moment for grace instead of a threat. Tongues will not be silenced, but will instead advocate. And hands will reach out, working for peace in their homeland, working for justice in the lands where they seek safe haven. Lord, protect all refugees in their travels. May they find a friend in me, and so make me worthy of the refuge I have found in you. Amen. Okay, Tony, next slide. And so, as I think many of you are all aware, the United States has a somewhat contentious relationship with migration in general. We like to think of ourselves as a land of plenty that, that sort of under the guidance of the Statue of Liberty has, opened its doors to those who are hungry and fleeing violence and suffering and persecution and hunger across the country. But it's clear, if you look at history, that there's a contentious relationship. America has not always been open, but there's always a struggle to make it open. And we can really see this kind of situation play out, beginning in the period surrounding World War II, where the United States doors had closed in 1924 because of the quota legislation. It made it very difficult for refugees who were fleeing violence in Europe, particularly at that time, to find a home here in the United States. And throughout the 1930s, even when there was knowledge of the growing persecution in Germany and in other parts of Europe, there was resistance to allowing people to enter into the United States and to find a new home here. And so the war came, and there was massive displacement that occurred as a consequence of it. Millions of Europeans had to flee their homelands, particularly in Germany and Central Europe. And this led to a severe crisis in the months and years following the war. Catholic Relief Services was originally founded as War Relief Services in, I believe it was 1943, and was given the task by the bishops to sort of be the American Catholic voice leading the relief effort in Europe. And they played a really important role in the aftermath of the war to respond to the needs of displaced persons. On sort of the domestic side, the Catholic bishops were constantly and repeatedly vying for legislation that would increase admissions of refugees into the United States. And this culminated in the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which was a really important piece of legislation because it allowed the entree of over 200,000 displaced persons from Europe into the country. And it overcame a significant amount of resistance from some political circles at the time. And then again throughout the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, in cases such as the Hungarian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution that sent, countless Cubans here to the United States fleeing under Castro's rule, the Vietnam War, which also created a significant outflux of refugees from that entire region. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, along with other organizations, many of whom make up what's the Refugee Council USA, which are the resettlement agencies that sort of take on the responsibility of working with the government to resettle refugees into the country. We're really on the front lines, constantly trying to garner support for refugee resettlement and admissions. It was an important task, really. But one of the really interesting phenomenon, if you look at the early even following the Displaced Persons Act, is that this was a time period when the Catholic resettlement network really began to take shape. The Catholic Church, the Catholic bishops, really reached out to dioceses and local communities and Catholic charities around the country, asking for their help to resettle many of the displaced persons that were coming from Europe. And there was a significant response to this call that allowed the Catholic Church to be a major player. And over the course of the next 30 years or so, this network really formed the basis of the network that we have today under the establishment of the 1980 Refugee Act. Now, the Refugee Act itself really came about largely in response to the fact that there was a significant kind of ad hoc approach to how we responded to refugee situations, whether we're talking about the Vietnamese or the Cubans or the Hungarians. It was very disparate. Different types of rules applied to different populations. Political issues emerged that sort of created resistances in some ways and sort of attitudes of welcoming in other ways. So there was really a recognition that this needed to be standardized. And so the Refugee Act of 1980 really helps to standardize the system through which refugees were brought into the United States. It also created, as I mentioned earlier, the system, this public-private partnership that exists today. And so there is we talk about the 40th anniversary of the 1980 Refugee Act, but there is at least a 40-year period that extends before that, which allows for, which sort of helps us to make sense of how the Refugee Act came into place. I'm happy to answer more questions or any questions later on. Can you go to the next slide, Tony?
Sure. And Todd, if you could hold on for just a minute. I need to conference in Matt again. So could you give me
Sure.
25 seconds to conference him in?
Not a problem.
Great, thanks. Todd, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, go ahead. Thanks.
Great. So I kind of got ahead of myself in the slides, I think, a little bit regarding the Refugee Act of 1980 and what did it do.
Do I need the backup one?
No. I just jumped ahead of myself. We are in the perfect spot. As I mentioned, it standardized the system. It created a framework through which the private-public partnership emerged. It really laid the ground, the foundation for how we do our work today in the refugee resettlement sphere. So it's a pivotal moment when we're talking about migration policy. and legislative action, by the U.S. government on a national level to respond to this problem and to help make sense of it in terms of how we move forward. One of the key things I think that's worth mentioning further Matt was going to talk about a little bit more, is that one of the key elements sort of that became related to the the Refugee Act of 1980 and kind of its aftermath is the importance of the presidential determination when it came to admissions of refugees. The fluctuations in that, particularly in a more contemporary context, has created some interesting dynamics that we're dealing with today. I won't say more on that. Leave it as a teaser. Allow Matt to pick that up in a few minutes when we turn it over to him. You can, next slide, Tony. Great, and so this is just a really kind of brief and overly simplistic graph, really. If you look back at 1980, the first year that this was kind of in place, we brought in about 166,000 refugees across the country, and then this number diminished somewhat, and it sort of peaks and valleys, because even if you look into the 1980s, the number dropped down into like the 40,000, 45, 50,000 range, I believe it was, in the mid-1980s, jumped back up in the the early 1990s, fell back a little bit. But if you look at the overall course of the history of the refugee admissions program from 1980 on, we've averaged, I believe it's about 95,000, 85,000, 95,000 refugees that have been admitted into the program. So while there have been fluctuations, it's really remained strong, and most importantly, it's really been a bipartisan effort. It has not been a politically contentious thing for the most part over the 40 years of its existence. Republicans and Democrats alike generally supported it. It provided pretty generous appropriations. There have been moments when it's kind of taken a hit. Post 9/11, for example, we ran into some difficulties because of the security concerns that emerged. But within a few years after that, it really became healthy and vibrant again. And so there is a kind of an inherent impulse, it seems, within the political system to recognize the needs of refugees and the importance of resettling them into the United States. So even in tough times, I think we can at least hang our hat on that, and it gives us hope that our actions, our advocacy, our work can help to strengthen the program again. If you look at 2019, I'm not going to dwell on this very much because I know Matt's going to talk about it, but it's dropped to about 37,000 for last fiscal year, to about 37,000. That includes about 7,000 SIVs. So if you look at just traditional refugees, that hovered around 30,000. So that's a significant drop, and we're going to see probably even fewer this year. We will see fewer this year. But I'll leave this chart at that. It's just to kind of give a taste. And if anyone's interested in kind of a more detailed analysis of the numbers in terms of refugee resettlement over the years, I'd be happy to give that to you. Just let Tony know, and we have that data on hand. Next slide, Tony. Great. So and this is real. I'll transition out from my point here. Why is your engagement so important? Well, it's important on a couple levels. First, we'll see from Matt's discussion how important it is on the advocacy level. Working to ensure that appropriations for refugee resettlement and related migration programs remain strong, and also making sure that legislation isn't passed that will weaken the system. As a third rung sort of to that discussion, and this is one that's a little bit more difficult because the administration has so much power to shape policy through administrative policy. It's really important that we engage advocacy, both with our elected representatives, in Congress, perhaps best through them, to put pressure on the administration to make sure that they don't take measures that is going to weaken the system. So advocacy or engagement is super, super, super important. It's also important on the local level, and this is where Sister Peggy will come in after Matt speaks, that, a lot of the action occurs locally, in order to make migrants feel welcome, in order to make refugees feel at home, to help them integrate, to help them become self-sufficient, to help them kind of establish themselves in their new home and to provide educational opportunities for their children and so on and so forth. it is important for people to reach out on the local level. I would point to one program that we have here, which is, I think, proven to be a really dynamic program. And it's called the Parishes Organized to Welcome Immigrants and Refugees, the POWER program. If you're not familiar with that, I would urge you to reach out to Tony to get a little bit more. It's basically a parish-based, diocesan-based, locally based kind of effort through which we provide funding to in order to help welcome and integrate refugees. These are two key kind of verbs that Pope Francis has used, to welcome and to integrate. And with that, to promote and to protect. I mean, this is really our obligation: protect refugees and migrants, to promote their interests, to welcome them, and to help them integrate once they move here. And so you can do that in a variety of ways. I'm going to turn it over to Matt now. You've heard enough of my speaking, but I'm happy to answer any questions moving forward. Matt, please take over.
Matt, are you connected? Matt, you may need to press *1 to unmute your phone.
I just did that. Can you hear me
You're
okay?
on. Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you just fine, Matt. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot, Tony. Next slide, please. So, as Todd said, I'm going to give some of the backdrop on the current situation with refugees. And the kind of language that we use around this is, in a general term you'll hear, is forced displacement. And so you've heard of people who are forcibly displaced inside their countries. Those are internally displaced persons. And also refugees who are displaced outside of their countries and become refugees because of persecution for various reasons. What we see in the world right now is an unprecedented amount of forced displacement, with 70.8 million people forcibly displaced. And that includes 25.9 million refugees. And again, refugees are people forced to flee their country because of persecution due to race, nationality, political opinion, religion, or membership in a particular social group. One thing to be aware of is that refugees, the main aim with refugees that refugees have and that refugee advocates and service providers have is to move refugees from being in a refugee situation to being back to normal life, normal day-to-day life. And there's three different avenues traditionally for that. One is for people to go home again, like when the war is over, when the persecution has ceased. Another one is for people to make their home in the nearby refugee host country that might just be just across the border. So many people make a new life in that neighboring host country. But for a small percentage of refugees, there's been something provided and developed over the years, with the United States taking a huge lead in developing it. And that's for people who either can't go home or they're also not able to live a safe, dignified life in the neighboring host country. So for them, resettlement has been developed. And right now in the world, there's 1.44 million people who are in need of resettlement, that durable solution. So next, please. So we're talking a lot about numbers here, and just so we don't objectify folks and think of people just as numbers. We recognize each person has a human face, a human story. Everybody made in the image of God. And what we notice here, for example, is some of the big refugee situations in the world in these four pictures. So on the left, the upper left-hand corner, we're all aware of the many people from Syria who have taken flight across the Mediterranean seeking safety, and here's a fellow with his baby just making his way to safety of the shore. Or Africa, we're well aware that about half of the world's refugees come from Africa, and the many situations there. We've had a lot of Congolese, for example, who've come to the United States, a lot of people from a lot of Somalis as well, and a lot of other people from Africa. To the right there, we have a little boy from Burma, and a lot of people have fled religious persecution from Burma. For many years, it's been Christians fleeing religious persecution, and more recently, there have been also a lot of people of Muslim faith who are also fleeing for their lives, and many finding refuge in the United States. And in the corner down in the right-hand corner there, we see a border area in very close to home here in Venezuela, which is fast becoming the largest refugee situation in the world. UNHCR says there'll be up to 6.5 million refugees there by the end of 2020. Next, please, Tony. So one thing that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years is quite a large increase in the resettlement need. And as we recall here, resettlement is just for a very small portion of the refugee population. As you'll see from this, it's about 5% of the refugee population are being identified for resettlement. So it's really those who are most in need and can't get a solution by going home or can't get a solution by staying in a neighboring host country. And what we've seen is quite a huge, just about a 50% increase from 2015 to 2020. And we see the rise where it's gone from 2015 to 16, the rise over 1 million. And it continuing to grow largely because in 17 and 18, largely because of the continuing Syrian situation, and then with the Venezuelan situation, and then the protracted nature of other situations where they're not getting resolved. So we end up with a huge need, the largest that have been identified thus far of 1.44 million refugees. And as we recall, it's not like one country takes all these in a year, but oftentimes these folks are spread over a number of years. But we're just talking about the kind of a snapshot of need at this time. Next, please. Thank you, Tony. While there's been a growth in the need for resettlement for those most vulnerable refugees, what we've seen, unfortunately, is a decline in the U.S. Refugee program. And Todd had mentioned what's called the presidential determination. So every year, the President of the United States makes a presidential determination on refugee admissions and makes that determination right around October 1st of each year, which is the beginning of the federal fiscal year, which goes from the beginning of October to the end of September of the following year. And over the 40 years of the program, 95,000 is the average, and Todd showed you the bar graphs of how that number goes up and down ordinarily according to global need. Unfortunately, what we've seen at this time of growing global needs for resettlement is a decline in the U.S. Presidential determination. So at the end of the previous administration, it was the number for FY17 was set in October, so prior to the election, and that number was 110,000. And again, this was especially to try to meet that growing need identified of folks, especially in the Middle East, along with other populations across the continents. But unfortunately, the actual arrivals that year were just under 54,000. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that when we get to that second column that you see on this slide. But then in FY18, unfortunately, the goal was set at a low level, the lowest on record up to that time of 45,000. And unfortunately, not even about half of that number was actually arrived. So there's a challenge that year, both in setting of the goal, but also in delivering on the goal. In FY19, the goal, again, was the lowest ever, 30,000. And with strong efforts, everybody pulled together, and 30,000 did indeed arrive. We were disappointed to see it go down again in FY20 to 18,000. And so far, it's going to be difficult to make that number. Already, the pace was a little behind schedule. And then, of course, all of us on the call, and certainly refugees are part of this, being impacted by the COVID-19 virus. I'll just briefly mention that part of the reason for the declining program was the lower presidential determinations each of those first 3 years. But the other thing was that there were some policy changes as well. So not just operational decisions, but also policy changes. And these came in the form of executive orders, and we just have a kind of a listing of those. And those with the asterisk are refugee-related ones. And those included the various travel bans. And then the last one on the list there is kind of the most recent affecting refugees, which was the required consent from local and state officials in order to resettle in a given locale. Next, please. So what are the solutions to the declining U.S. program and to doing our role within the international community? Well, first off, on the executive actions, which we just covered, of course, the administration issued the executive action, so at any time they would have the power to reverse the executive actions. So that would be one thing. Also, in the case of the executive actions, in the case of about 6 of them, all except for the very last one on that list on the previous page, Congress has actually, both the Senate and House, have introduced a bill that's called the No Ban Act. And this bill would actually vacate that list of executive orders on the previous page. As I said a minute ago, all except the last executive order there. That's not included in that ban, in the No Ban Act. And just a couple more minutes on the No Ban Act. This is a solution that the Catholic bishops have very much supported. And so as each of those individual bans have come out, USCCB has opposed them and explained why we thought that they were not good policy, both from the standpoint of sort of the American character, us as an immigrant refugee nation, a welcoming nation, and particularly on the refugee side, where we view ourselves as Christians of also having that responsibility for welcoming the stranger, and especially when they're victims of forced migration, really helping them, as the Pope calls us, to welcome them, protect them, like Todd said. So that's with the No Ban Act. So that's one of the solutions that Congress has presented. As we look at the annual refugee arrivals, again here, the administration could increase the presidential determinations and also make sure that each year that the arrivals are fully met. So that's still very much something we continue to urge the administration to do, and to return to normal levels, which historically are 95,000, goal of 95,000 refugees every year. Also, Congress, not seeing progress by the administration in addressing the issue itself, has said, well, we could do it with legislation. And so both the House and Senate have introduced the GRACE Act. And essentially what the GRACE Act does is it looks at the history of the program and also the history of humanitarian leadership that the United States has provided. And it says, well, let's get back to normal. And that means at least normal, they say. And normal is 95,000 each year as a minimum of the number of refugees coming. And we're all mindful that it's 95,000 refugees, but also that we're a country of 300 million people. So we have some pretty broad shoulders and a lot of gifts that God has given us. So 95,000 in the view of Congress is the least that we could do on an annual basis. And here again, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops very much supports this GRACE Act as well. Next slide, please. So what's our challenge? How do we go about this? Well, first off, traditionally, through the years, from its passage and on through the years, the Congress, and then both Democratic and Republican presidents through the years have all supported the refugee program. It's had a strong bipartisan support. And so what we need to do is make sure that that legacy of the program is able to shine brightly once again, that we encourage every one of our state, local, and federal officials, local and national levels, to support the program, and to also not just hear the numbers, but also meet the refugees who are in our communities and get to know them. And another part of that often is to see the wonderful success stories that refugees have in communities throughout the United States, and that many, many local officials are supportive of refugees as human beings, but also realize what a huge contribution they make also economically and culturally to every community that they become part of. So one way that we can do that over these coming months is through Justice for Immigrants. And many of you already get the action alerts and the support of help, social media, also the weekend reviews that come out. So we encourage that, and that will include in the coming months action alerts about the solutions that we just talked about a little bit ago, the No Ban Act, the GRACE Act, and also the presidential determination that Todd mentioned earlier. We continue to advocate on that as well, and all together our voices make a real difference. Also, periodically Congress is home for in-state and district visits. And so that's a good time to meet your officials and express your concern for refugees and your support of refugees, and help them to get to know refugees in their community. And we're looking forward in June to World Refugee Day, and we encourage everybody, as always, to have those local kinds of events, and to invite officials as well to speak or to participate, and to hear the wonderful music and eat the wonderful food that refugees have brought that make America such a rich place to live and work. So with that, I just wanted to make one further note, and that is that we're all very much and very rightly so preoccupied and working to be part of the solution on the COVID-19 virus. So for that reason, you'll notice that our focus often here at JFI during this period is to be very mindful of the struggles that we're all going through right now, and to have solidarity for one another and for that common challenge. And we're mindful that refugees face that challenge side by side with all of us. But that some of the advocacy that we'll be doing will be coming as some of these urgent things are dealt with, and as the situation gets a little calmer through the months here. But with that, I'll hand it over to Todd and to Sister.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Tony's having some technical difficulties.
Oh, no, Todd, yep. I'm okay. I just can't see the comments. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
I know, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Some technical difficulties related to the comment box and being able to see it. So I'm sort of going to comment for a few minutes. Before I turn it over to Sister Peggy, I want to, there's a question, Matt. And could you reiterate what is the house number for the GRACE Act is?
The house number for the
GRACE Act.
I'll have to, let me look that up.
Sure. We'll get back to you we can get back to you later on after Sister Peggy goes. Sister Peggy, are you there?
Sister Peggy, you may need to press *1 to unmute your phone.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay.
So what you're going to have to do, just as an FYI moving forward, when you want the slide to move forward, just tell Tony and he will do that.
And I have you on the first slide here now, Sister Peggy. Thank you for joining us from the balmy state of South Dakota and Sioux Falls. Go ahead, Sister Peggy.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, thanks for having me, and I hope that the slides that I have here and the story we have to share may help others. I'm a presentation sister with the community in Aberdeen, South Dakota, which is in the northern part. The slide that you see on the right is the Diocese of Sioux Falls. And Sioux Falls is actually pretty much down in the southeast corner. So you can see from one end to the other the distance that we have there. I'm part of our congregational Hispanic ministry called Caminando Juntos, which means walking together. And we've been serving the Hispanics for the past 20 years. So the diocese, as I'll go on here, if you could go to the next slide, I just want to show you, I'll tell you, we are a rural diocese, and maybe there's other people on this webinar that maybe might resonate with this. We cover a large territory. We serve everything east of the Missouri River, so we're often called East River, South Dakota. And the other side of the river is the Rapid City Diocese. The whole population of the state is under 1 million, and the population of the diocese is about 500,000. We're only one congressional district as well. And if you want to imagine how big we are, size-wise, it's about the size of Indiana. So we're not the majority, what you would say, religion, 24%. Largest is Lutheran. And I reside down here in Sioux Falls, and we're the largest city in the whole diocese at 183,000. So we're a rural diocese. Next slide. just to give you a snapshot of what our resources are and aren't, well, I'll show you that, we don't have an office for refugee resettlement. We don't have a Catholic Charities office. We don't have a diocesan Hispanic ministry office. We don't have a social concerns office. We do have a Respect Life office, and we do have a Catholic conference. That's about the extent of it. However, they do a lot of work. Next slide. Now, when it comes to refugee services, our LSS, Lutheran Social Services, is our resettlement agency in South Dakota, and they've been serving South Dakota since 1948. So I just thought I'd put some numbers there about numbers of refugees they've received. You can see the drop from almost 500 to 130 this past year. And most of our refugees come from the Congo, Eritrea, Ukraine, Burma. We're kind of the point city for them to be received, but then they have secondary locations in more rural towns where they end up. Next slide. Okay, World Refugee Day events. What did it look like around here from 2003 to 2016? On the left, you see our dear Clara Hart, and she's our Refugee Congress delegate for South Dakota, and a highly respected leader in our refugee and broader community. She, along with the resources that she has access to, the United Nations and the Refugee Congress, she engaged for all those years all by herself. She's a refugee herself from Mozambique. She engaged the school children in the schools around refugee issues. Next slide. Then a lot of things started happening when this new administration came into existence. I'm also a part of our local Pax Christi, South Dakota chapter. And in early 2017, we as a state and as a people here, we're experiencing an increase in Islamophobia, which many of you probably experienced as well. Our state legislature was proposing anti-immigration and anti-refugee legislation. We had anti-Islam speakers speaking to large groups in several of our rural communities. You see some of us standing there with our signs in protest. And so as a local Pax Christi, we said we need to be as vocal and as visible as the negative forces around here. So our local Pax Christi group said we can't do this alone. So we talked about finding ways to reach out to other groups in the area. And Justice for Immigrants and Catholic Relief Services, we went online and saw quite a few resources that we could access. And so we engaged LSS and the Refugee Congress, our own office, the Sioux Falls Multicultural Center. We came to the table, started planning. It was 6 weeks out, and we put together a first community-wide Refugee Day. And next slide, please. So just want to make the point that we were like a grassroots committee. We weren't just Catholics. We were all people who were on the same page of wanting to have some positive impact, bring the positive side of refugees to awareness in people's lives. You might think, well, because we didn't have this and didn't have that in our diocese, it actually gave us an opportunity to reach out and to become a broad-based community. Next slide. So that Refugee Day that we put together in 6 weeks included a simulation of what a refugee might have to go through to enter their host country. We had ration displays, and we had different tables of explaining the refugee process. We had some ethnic food trucks on the campus. We had the mayor come and read a proclamation. We had a bus come down of students from Aberdeen, South Dakota. That was a 3.5-hour ride down. And I think we counted about 150 participants. Next slide, please. And here's some pictures of that event. Besides us being surprised by the turnout, the weather in South Dakota was actually just about perfect. We didn't even have a wind, which is most unusual out here. So God was good, and you can see that there was a lot of variety in people who came. So we were quite surprised, and I think it provided the impetus to keep going. So instead of waiting 6 weeks prior to planning, we started the day after this event to plan the next year. Next slide, please. Well, the next year wasn't as, we got tested a little bit. We were totally washed out. And but thank the good Lord, we had a plan B, and we went inside the Lutheran Social Services building, and again had a redesign the simulation process. We included refugee youth to act as guides and leaders, taking people from one station to another. And we started to think about getting local media coverage. Food trucks, we had more than, this year we had 2 food trucks. And then we also had a local artist who created our logo. Tony, next slide. And this is, on the right, you'll see the painting that our local artist designed. It shows the falls, the Sioux Falls, and all the people from the various countries coming through the falls. This year we had the simulation was done in a local Lutheran church. I don't know. We don't need to. You could listen to that Dakota News in light of the fact that we're probably 9 minutes out here. So why don't we go to the next slide? So this year, as Providence would have it, again we said, I think we've run the course, on the simulation idea. So we sat down, and you'll notice on the bottom there the guiding values. Mm-hmm. We said, okay, if we were going to develop something, have something new, what might be those guiding values? So we came up with 3. That any event that we would have or discern, we would say it had to have an education component, an event that would provide education of refugee issues and experience. And then number 2, the next value would be solidarity. It'd have to be an event that would promote our solidarity with refugees, where we would feel like we're learning more about who they are. And then number 3 would be to celebrate, an event that celebrates the refugees' contributions to society. So, wouldn't you know, we came up with 3 events. So in a sense, we created a trinity of values and a trinity of events here. Our World Refugee Day turned into a World Refugee Weekend. Now, we're not there yet. Hopefully, God willing, we'll be able to celebrate this. But we added 3 new partners, and how it's going to look is the first night, we had this new Levitt stage built last year. and we have all these free concerts for the community. So we engaged the Levitt Foundation, and they got a world-renowned group called Barrio Manose. And so we're going to have this concert. We're going to have pre-show up there with local refugee groups. And then we're going to have craft and display tables and the Green Card Voices banners. The pre-show is we got a Nepali soccer girl dancers and Tanzanian music group. So we tried to get different countries. So if you want to turn the next slide, Tony, thank you. And then Saturday we're going to have one of our new partners is the library, and so they're so good. We're just delighted to have them as a partner. They're going to display these Green Card Voices display. There are 21 banners that they're going to put up with the stories and the faces. You talk about the human face and the human story. Matt was talking about that. That's important. So we're going to have those up for a whole month in the library. Also, the library is going to do all of the marketing for us. They're going to get the city to do the flyers, etc. So they become a valuable partner. Then on Sunday, the library is going to sponsor a refugee panel, and then they'll do whatever to make that work for us. Plus, we've got some videos from. We have a new group, 501c3 group called South Dakota Voices for Peace, and they put together an amazing video called Raised in South Dakota, and they feature about 5 different refugees and immigrants where they tell their stories. So that's going to be a part of that panel as well. So, I think that's about it. So next slide, which is kind of the end. I just love that local artist, Hector Curiel, who did our logo. He also did this. And I just love it, and I just thought I'd leave you all with that for the final slide. Thank you.
Thank you, sister. This is really fantastic. A lot of really good insights, I think, for everyone who watches this. Really appreciate you coming on board and participating on the webinar. Matt, I don't know if you're still on. I don't know if you were able to find the number, the house number for the GRACE Act or not. If not, we can.
I was. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you, Matt.
Yeah, it's HR 2146.
HR 2146.
Yeah, and whoever noticed that, thanks a lot. Sorry for the oversight.
And Jim Thomas is
Thanks, Jim.
the fellow who asked that. So, well, thanks so much, Tony. I don't know if you have some final words to say, but I just want to, before you do, I just want to tell everyone thanks for joining us. Thanks for the participants on the webinar, Matt and Sister Peggy. I really appreciate your taking the time to do this, particularly at a time that's so difficult for many of us out there. So thanks again, and we hope to have you on soon. I'm sure we'll have you on, Matt, more than one time in the coming months.
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for spending an hour with us. Please take care of yourselves and your families. Prayer will help get us through this, and Lenten blessings to all. Thank you, everybody. Take care. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.